Ever heard the saying, "You are what you eat"? Well, today we're diving into a historical case study that proves just how true that is. And get this, it involves a surprising hero, sprouted grain.
And a whole lot of scurvy. We're talking about a disease so devastating, it shaped, well, everything. Exploration, warfare, even what we drink today.
We're using excerpts from Christian Berger's research on malt, beer, all of that to kind of unravel this fascinating paradox. You see, ancient cultures, they knew how to prevent this deadly disease, yet it plagued humanity for centuries. How is that possible?
Imagine this. Millions of deaths, not from battles, not from shipwrecks, but from a lack of one crucial vitamin. That's scurvy.
It's easy to think of scurvy as just, a sailor's problem, like something out of a pirate movie. But it actually ravaged land-based communities for centuries, especially during times of famine, war.
Exactly. Imagine a city under siege, cut off from fresh supplies. So the people inside, they're already weakened. Their bodies are starved for nutrients.
And that's where scurvy thrives, right?
Right.
Like the body's way of sounding a very loud alarm. We need vitamins, stat.
And not just any vitamins. Vitamin C, which, as you know, is crucial for everything, from wound healing to immunity. Now picture those same conditions, but on a ship in the middle of the ocean. Voyages in the 14th century, they could last for months, with absolutely no access to fresh fruits or vegetables.
So scurvy went from being a threat to just a near certainty.
And the descriptions from explorers like Jacques Cartier, oh, they're enough to make anyone want to stay on dry land.
Yeah, I bet.
Swollen gums, teeth literally falling out, ulcers covering the body.
Cartier, he lost a quarter of his crew to scurvy while exploring Canada in 1535. And he wasn't alone. Magellan, Bering. Scurvy just decimated crews across the globe. It's heartbreaking because, as we'll see, it was preventable.
And this is where the story takes, well, I think a surprising turn. While the rest of Europe was struggling, the Vikings, those legendary seafarers, they had a surprising handle on scurvy. And get this, as early as the 9th century.
Wait, the Vikings?
Yep.
The same ones known for, their brutal raids and horned helmets.
The very same. They were successfully crossing the Atlantic centuries before Columbus, and their secret weapon, malt.
Not beer, but malt.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating twist.
And it's something you're probably familiar with, even if you don't realize it. We see the health benefits of sprouted grains everywhere these days. Bread, smoothie.
It's true. Sprouted grains are all the rage, but I never knew they had this ancient connection to scurvy prevention. So what was it about malt that made it a Viking superfood?
It all comes down to vitamin C. When grains like barley sprout, their vitamin C content, it just skyrockets. The Vikings, whether they fully understood the science or not, they were tapping into a potent natural remedy.
So they had this simple solution to a deadly problem, and they just, forgot to mention it to the rest of the world.
Well, it's not quite that simple. We do see mentions of malt in their sagas, their ancient stories. And the word scurry itself, it has roots in Nordic languages, so the knowledge was there. But for reasons that still kind of mystify historians, it faded from common practice.
While the rest of Europe was losing sailors by the thousands. Okay, I have to admit, that's kind of a head-scratcher. But before we unravel that mystery, let's talk about a beverage that became both a blessing and a curse in the fight against scurvy, beer.
Here's the thing. Beer, at least the way they brewed it back then, it did have some benefits. Not because of any, magical properties, but because it was often safer to drink than water, especially on these long voyages.
So it wasn't really about the beer itself, but what it replaced.
Exactly. Think contaminated water sources, bacteria. Beer was the safer alternative. The English Navy, for instance, they made beer rations standard, not because they understood the vitamin C connection, simply to keep their sailors from, drinking themselves sick.
It's like they stumble upon a partial solution, but missed the bigger picture. And the irony is they were so close.
It's almost tragic. They had this readily available, highly effective solution in malt, and yet it was overlooked for centuries.
Okay, so we've got the Vikings, who were surprisingly ahead of the game with malt. Then we have centuries of scurvy-ravaging sailors, while beer is seen as, somewhat helpful. But not for the right reasons. Where does it go from here? It's like one of those moments in a mystery novel where you just want to yell at the detective, the answer's right there.
If only they had known then what we know now, right?
Exactly. But that's history for you, I guess.
Yeah.
Only clear in hindsight. So how do we get from all these near misses to finally cracking the scurvy code?
Well, enter a forward-thinking physician, a Dr. James McBride. In the 1760s, he began advocating for something he called a malt infusion.
Malt infusion. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, does it? Sounds a lot less appealing than, say, a cold beer?
Well, today we would call it wort. Basically, the sugary liquid that's extracted from mashed malt before it's fermented into beer. McBride, he was convinced that this wort, rich in vitamin C, was the key to preventing scurvy.
Makes you wonder if he ever, enjoyed a pint himself while working on his research. But I imagine it wasn't easy convincing the powers that be that this wort was the answer.
You're right about that. The Admiralty, those are the folks in charge of the British Navy. Tough crowd. And this was still a time when medical knowledge was, well, let's just say it was evolving. The whole concept of vitamins as we know them today, that was still a long way off.
So how did McBride's ideas go from being dismissed, almost like fringe science, to actually being used on voyages?
That's where our friend Captain James Cook enters the picture.
Oh, of course, Captain Cook.
Remember him. The explorer charted vast stretches of the Pacific.
His voyages were legendary.
And you know what? His commitment to his crew's well-being was really ahead of its time. Influenced by McBride's work, Cook decided to put this malt infusion to the test during his second voyage, which set sail in 1772.
Okay, and what happened? Don't leave me hanging.
The results were astounding. 3 years at sea, exploring some of the most remote, challenging parts of the world, and only one scurvy-related death amongst his entire crew.
Wow, that's incredible, especially compared to the devastating losses on other voyages.
It really was a testament to Cook's, well, first of all, his meticulous approach to his crew's health, but also his willingness to embrace new ideas, even if they weren't, standard naval practice at the time.
You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Cook proved that malt infusion works, everyone switches to wort, problem solved.
You would think so, wouldn't you? But that's not quite how the story unfolds. Despite Cook's, well, resounding success, the British Navy makes a decision that, frankly, still baffles historians today.
Wait, they didn't start giving all the sailors wort. What happened?
They opted for a different solution: lemon juice.
Lemon juice. But why? I mean, Cook had just demonstrated that malt was incredibly effective.
It's one of those head-scratching moments in history where, well, practicality, it seems, sort of trumped effectiveness. See, lemons, they were readily available throughout the vast British Empire, which made them a lot easier to, source and distribute than malt.
So in a way, logistics and economics won out over what was actually a truly effective solution.
Sadly, it seems so. It was a missed opportunity on, well, a grand scale, especially considering that some explorers, like the French explorer La Perouse, for example, they continued to use malt with great success, echoing Cook's findings.
So malt, this ancient remedy with a proven track record, gets pushed aside. What a frustrating turn of events. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
Not quite. See, in the 19th century, the world of brewing underwent a major transformation, really, with the rise of industrialization. Beer production was about to change forever.
And I'm guessing this change had some, shall we say, unintended consequences for the fight against scurvy.
Unfortunately, yes. You see, the traditional methods of malting, the way the Vikings would have done it, it involved air drying the grain at low temperatures, which preserved that precious vitamin C. But these new industrial techniques, they were all about efficiency, about profit, and they introduced high-temperature roasting.
Those high temperatures, they destroyed the vitamin C.
Exactly. So while these industrial advancements, they did lead to more consistent, more shelf-stable beers, they also, and this is the ironic part, they inadvertently removed the very element that made beer a potential weapon against scurvy.
It's a classic example, isn't it? Progress in one area can have some pretty unforeseen consequences in another. And in this case, it meant that sailors were being given beer that was no longer the anti-scurvy drink it once might have been. Makes you wonder how differently things might have turned out if they'd stuck with the, well, I don't know, the old ways of doing things. But this isn't the last we hear of scurvy, is it? So we've got this forgotten remedy, malt, making a comeback, thanks to Dr. McBride, Captain Cook. Only to be sidelined again by, what, the convenience of lemon juice and the unintended consequences of making beer on a massive scale? You'd think that would be the end of the story, right? But scurvy had one more surprise up its sleeve, didn't it?
It did. It takes us far from the open ocean to the trenches of World War I.
World War I. Okay, now that's a curveball I did not see coming. We're talking land-based warfare in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. What does that have to do with the disease we've mostly associated with, well, sailors?
It turns out that the conditions in those trenches, I mean, think cramped quarters, limited access to fresh food, immense physical stress. They mirrored those long sea voyages in a lot of ways.
So even though warfare had changed, the nutritional needs of those soldiers hadn't.
No, they hadn't. And guess what resurfaced as a remedy?
Let me guess. Malt.
Close? Sprouted grains. This time in the form of bean sprouts. Doctors rediscovered their effectiveness in treating scurvy among the soldiers.
It's like this ancient knowledge had a way of bubbling back up when humanity needed it most.
It really is remarkable, and it wasn't just anecdotal evidence this time. A physician, Dr. Wiltshire, he is working with Serbian troops during the war, and he actually conducted experiments that definitively proved the power of sprouted grains in combating scurvy.
From Viking voyages to World War I trenches, sprouted grains have been this, I don't know, this unsung hero in the fight against scurvy.
It really makes you think. What other simple, natural solutions have we overlooked in our pursuit of more complex remedies?
It's a good reminder that sometimes the answers are right in front of us, hidden in plain sight, or in this case, in a simple sprouted seed. But before we wrap up, I have to ask about something you mentioned earlier, the role of genetics in scurvy.
Ah, yes. This is fascinating, isn't it? Adds another layer of complexity to the story. We've talked a lot about diet, what you eat, but it turns out that even with access to the same foods, some people, well, they were genetically predisposed to scurvy.
So even with those lemons on board, some sailors were fighting a losing battle from the start.
In a way, yes. There's a gene that controls a variation of this gene that makes them less efficient at absorbing and using this vital nutrient.
That's incredible. So this whole time we've been talking about scurvy as a dietary deficiency, which it is, but it's also this fascinating interplay between what our genes and the environment we live in.
Precisely. It's a reminder that the story of human health is rarely simple. It's a complex tapestry woven from our genes, our environment, even as we've seen today, our history.
We've certainly seen that today with scurvy. We've journeyed from ancient Viking ships to the trenches of World War I, uncovering some, well, let's just say surprising twists and turns along the way.
And we've seen how a simple sprouted grain, once a Viking secret, holds a powerful key to understanding, well, not just scurvy, but the interconnectedness of human health and the natural world.
It's amazing, isn't it? So next time you're, I don't know, enjoying a salad, maybe with some sprouts on top, or sipping on a craft beer brewed the old-fashioned way, of course, take a moment to appreciate the long and winding journey those ingredients have taken. You might just be tasting a bit of history and holding the solution to a centuries-old problem, well, right in your hands.